We're in the midst of a huge transformation where our peers, communities, and workplaces are all really melding into one. Welcome to Reimagining Company Culture. My name is Christina Giordano, she, her, hers. I'm the Partnerships and Community Manager here at AllVoices. Today, I'm thrilled to welcome our next guest onto the show, Dan Smolkin. He is the Head of People Operations at Aurora Solar. Thank you so much for being here, Dan. If you want to tell us a little bit about yourself for our audience members, including your pronouns, and when you were younger, do you remember how you answered the question, what do you want to be when you grow up?
Yeah, great. Well, first off, thanks, Christina, for having me on, and I'm really looking forward to our conversation here. So again, my name is Dan Smolkin. I'm the head of people operations at Aurora Solar, go by he, him, and I've been at Aurora for just about 3 years now. And so it's been an incredible journey for me, being able to see another startup go through this fundamental shift of growing from a small early stage company into a really growing and thriving startup. So it's an experience that I've really enjoyed in my own career working in HR, in tech, both having worked on building my own startup, but also having gotten my starting experience in HR as one of the first 10 employees at a company that grew to a couple hundred worldwide. So otherwise, really excited to share some of those learnings here. And then in terms of what I wanted to be when I grew up, there are so many different things that I wanted to be, but I would say the younger version of myself definitely wanted to be a train conductor. But then I realized, maybe there are other fields that are a bit more of a calling. And within the people operations space, I found something that I truly enjoy.
Incredible. Thank you for sharing that. As someone who rides the Amtrak frequently, train conductor really resonates with me as well. And I was reading through your bio to prepare for this interview, and so much experience in hyper kind of growth organizations, scaling out teams. And I have lots of questions about that, but also wanted to kind of ask an open-ended and vague question on purpose in terms of what defines you.
Yeah, and open-ended questions are my favorite ones. In terms of what defines me, it's more, I would say what defines me are the experiences that I've been able to have over the years. And whether, I'm born and raised in New Orleans, but I find myself, I moved to California after Hurricane Katrina. And truth be told, those are two of the most fundamental experiences in my life that shaped me incredibly. And going and seeing two very different cultures and, going through that experience of, I wasn't expecting to move to California or, for Hurricane Katrina to have happened. But, it really, it was one of those sudden jolts that I found myself in a new high school, in a new place, all in the matter of a couple of days. But it was that experience that led me down this journey of discovery, whether it was, the things that I wanted to take on, how I wanted to define myself, and really finding the things that I was most passionate about. So as something that I've taken with me through college, through my working experience, and really helped me, shape my perspective on not just looking and, always focusing on this here and now. And it's like, I've got 20 things on my task list that I need to do by the end of the day, but it's putting things in this bigger picture, but also looking at, as a New Orleanian, you learn such great ways of embracing the excitement of life, and especially really good food too. So I appreciate, being able to bring people in for a conversation. And, that's also how I approach HR, is not just about, tactically getting things done, but also it's how can we create, more of a sense of community, getting to know our colleagues and growing as teams.
Absolutely. Building that sense of community and belonging in a place where people can do their best work is so important. And to your point, to lived experiences of folks, and thank you for sharing yours as well, definitely impacts kind of how you show up in all spaces in your life as well. In terms of HR and people teams over the past 2+ years, I should say, we experienced so much change, but it's also with challenges is a great opportunity to be innovative, change things up, redesign, and put really progressive strategies in place as well. What are some examples of those kind of innovative people policies that you've seen leaders really implement at their organization, not necessarily at Aurora Solar, but whatever you've seen out there in the world?
Yeah, and I, in terms of what I've seen progressive companies doing, and I would include Aurora in that umbrella, is just embracing the inevitable. And that means, and this is speaking from the perspective of a tech company, but recognizing that not everyone needs to be in an office at the same time doing work and commuting in. And it's companies embracing the idea of saying, not only do we not need to be in the same place, but also work can happen on different schedules. And so it's breaking down some of these norms of saying, it's like, okay, you need to be in the office from this time to this time, but rather saying, it's like, great, if you need to go out and take care of something during your personal life during the day, like it shouldn't even be about like logging PTO time for that. It's like, take care of what you need to, because if you're scheduling life around work, then it's really difficult to actually balance both of those things. So I appreciate for us as a company that we've really created this sort of atmosphere where if you do need to take that time for yourself, you do. And also recognizing that not all of us need to be online at the exact same times to get work done, but it's rather, how can you work in such a way where you're going to maximize somebody else's ability to get things done when they're not in the same room as you. So and if I were to speak to a couple of our progressive policies that we implemented at Aurora, so one of the policies that I'm really proud of us having implemented that really recognized our shift from being a company that was in an office, and we were really focused on everyone needs to be in San Francisco, and then we opened a satellite office in Atlanta, and it's like people need to be in those places, to having completely made that shift to saying, we're okay with people working wherever they are, whether that's in California, whether that's in New Jersey, whether that's in Georgia. We have employees in about 33 different states and almost every province in Canada now. But the policy that I was most excited about having implemented to the team was just going directly out to the team and acknowledging and saying, hey, it's okay if you want to move somewhere else. And, even if we're not currently in that state, what's more important is that long-term relationship of you and as an employee of the company. And, if you move somewhere, we want to move there with you. And so creating that sort of proactive policy, just remove the question of saying, it's like, well, is it okay if I move to this other place? And saying, like, of course it's okay. There are a couple of things that we want to make sure that we take care of first. But nonetheless, giving employees that extra bit of permission and explicitly stating, this is how we're embracing the future of work as a distributed team.
Absolutely. There's been so many conversations of kind of work from home and then work from anywhere as well. Questions around having a conversation with your employer organization about that as well, that trust and long-term relationships. Too, can you tell me a little bit more about how you've kind of really embraced distributed work? And also there's been a lot of conversations too, whether you're in the same state or whether you're in the same town or you see people face to face, that FaceTime bias for team members. How are you thinking about kind of mitigating that as well?
Yeah, and so many great things within that question. But in terms of embracing distributed work, early on we were reticent to, and we were starting to dip our toes in the water. And this was back, even before COVID. We were recognizing it was difficult to hire just building a company in the San Francisco Bay Area, and we would keep finding candidates. Somebody refers somebody in, but they're in a different part of the country. And it's like, we're missing out on all of these great people just because we're so focused on saying, no, everyone needs to be in the office. But then it was when we really took a step back and said, it's like, wow, people are commuting like 2 or 3 hours round trip every day just to come into the office. They're spending thousands of dollars doing that too. And then you look at the actual cost of having an office, and it was asking and saying, like, well, why don't we just reinvest this in other ways? And saying, so for Aurora as a company, what we've intentionally de-emphasized is our focus on the office and really re-emphasized how important it is to work as a distributed team. So we had some distributed team members early on, but and a lot of those distributed team members, it just organically happened, life brought them to somewhere else. I was saying it's like we should really formalize this in terms of how we operate. But for some of the other things that we've really embraced is making sure that we have benefits that support employees wherever they are. So, we recognize as a very distributed team that, somebody may be, it's impossible for them to commute into the office on a regular basis, but they still may want to have a space that they can go into. So it's providing them with things like our recently launched co-working stipend, where every employee in the company outside of the Bay Area is eligible for a co-working stipend. Or, it's also providing employees with things to better set up their home environments. And that's whether they're in the San Francisco Bay Area or not. We want to make sure, everyone has a good, stable internet connection, but also providing everyone with a bonus when they start, or a stipend when they start, to buy equipment to make sure that they're getting the best possible at-home work setup. So, and the final thing that I would say, where we've really focused on developing effectively as a distributed team, is how we weave that into our daily interactions and culture. So, and that kind of divides itself into two parts. So part of it is all of the events and intentional engagement activities that we do just outside of people's job, bringing people together, recognizing, we need to work even harder than if we were in an office to make sure that we're creating a community amongst everyone on the team. And in fact, I've actually seen some of these things run better, just like we had a manager's retreat the other week. I felt like it actually ran better in a virtual format than it would have in a in-person format. And a couple of years ago, it's like, I would have never imagined myself saying that. But it's really focusing on creating meaningful experiences in a distributed context. And I have to give huge kudos to our workplace team, where they actually sent boxes of all of these surprises, and it's like, open this at this time. And it was this bring your own adventure with you as we were going through the retreat. But the other part of it is intentionally building in, as a part of our culture, how we work as a distributed team. And so from onboarding, we're really able to instill a lot of that right off the bat, is with all of our new hires, and saying it's like, here's good hygiene and process for working in a distributed environment, but also setting expectations like, it's okay to take breaks during the middle of the day. Like, it's okay to turn your camera off on Zoom if you've been on camera all day. But just as well, placing such emphasis on actually writing things down and making things discoverable. So I actually think that working in a distributed context pushes you to have better work processes. So that way your colleague isn't dependent on giving you a phone call or stopping by your desk to figure out where something is, but rather they can go in, they can find out asynchronously, whether it was a project a year ago or that's just in the last week, they can find the information that they need.
Absolutely. In order for async work to actually function and work, you need to have your written down processes. You need to help enable folks to do their job, of course, to the best of their ability, but in different time zones, especially when you're across the US and different provinces in Canada, and you're just spread out as well. And also to your earlier point as well, not assuming that people have their work from home set up correctly, or even the space too for the co-working stipend as well. I think that's so important too, if they need to get out of their spaces. And when we're talking about creating these meaningful points of connection, ensuring that you are connected to your manager and your team, I'd be remiss if we talk about equity in the workplace, especially now. And you've mentioned a couple of different examples, but in the interest of open source people practices, which is something that I read that you are also very supportive of. Can you tell us a little bit more about how you've redesigned systems to be more equitable as well at Aurora?
Yeah, and on the point around open source, I am a huge fan of applying an open source mindset to the world of people ops. And so many of us are creating awesome, great things within our own companies. And I feel like it's really important to share what we can as professionals as we look to move the people function forward. And as we come up with these great ideas, especially when you're a part of a small team, we're able to effectively collaborate with each other by being able to tap into the knowledge coming across so many different companies. But to the question around some of the systems that we've redesigned for greater equity, it's one of the things, and I'll try and think of a couple of examples on narrowing this down. But one of the things, first off, that I really appreciate that we do, and actually coming from earlier this morning, just a couple of hours ago, is our all hands meeting. And one of the things that, we had been doing this for years. Every Monday morning, the entire company gets on a call, but it was always like a department shares an update, and then that's pretty much it. But one of the things that we implemented was Q&A time as a company. And it's literally anyone can ask a question. There are a lot of great tools out there for this. But what I've found is that it equaled the playing field so much for employees to feel comfortable asking questions. And they can do so under their own name or anonymously. And more often than not, it's anonymously. But I see employees asking questions that they may have been reticent to ask, and but it's giving that sort of forum and also acknowledging those questions and taking the time, even if it's a really difficult question. And it varies everything from compensation practices to products to, you name it. That comes up in those questions, but it's giving everyone a forum where they can ask what's on their mind. And so I've seen really the change that's implemented for us as a company, and for employees really feeling that we're addressing the things that are important to them. And those questions often do push the needle or drive the needle, whatever the phrase may be,
Yeah.
on things that we know employees care about. And that's in addition to doing things like our ongoing pulse surveys. So whereas previously it used to be, it's like, let's just do an inflection survey. Now we focus on doing pulse surveys. And, every week it's a different subset of employees. We're asking, a core set of questions on how they're doing. And so we're keeping that constant pulse of what's going on in the company. And it's not just something for people or people teams, but the innovative practice, if you will, is also giving our leaders real-time access to that data. So they don't even need to come and ask and say, it's like, hey, can you run a report about this? They have access to a dashboard that's giving them that really meaningful people data to help them know how healthy is their team, what's on people's minds. So they're also able to focus on building the best possible teams.
Yeah, and I think that's really important as well in terms of making data-driven decisions, having that employee feedback, and really opening up the space to and have forum and meeting employees where they are, whether they want to assign their name to it, whether they want to give anonymous feedback or ask a question as well. And you mentioned the role of leaders and being able to have that dashboard, but also being able to keep a pulse on what's happening with their team. And leaders are part of the leadership team, so I'm sure people give you lots of feedback. But I want to kind of ask in terms of innovation, how do you empower folks across the organization, no matter what their role is, to practice this really equity-driven leadership to ensure that their processes are equitable and it's something that's top of mind for them?
Yeah, and this is a really good question too. And thinking about it from a couple of different perspectives, and saying one of the things first off that I'm really glad that we've implemented in the company is launching ERGs, and not just launching employee resource groups and saying it's like, okay, now we have a group, but it's really placing an emphasis on focus on how do we empower people the team captains of each of these ERGs to really drive a meaningful impact and giving them a stage and making sure that the work that's happening there is visible. And for us as a people team, it's collaborating with them and also, giving more insight into what practices look like behind the scenes. But it's getting this sort of information really helps us in terms of also taking a fresh look at some of our practices and saying, it's like, oh, well, we thought we were doing a good job at this, but actually it looks like we've still got some work to do. So I appreciate actually bringing in a little bit more of that pressure to making sure that we're also keeping an eye on things amongst all of the other projects that might be going on. It's making sure that we're also maintaining that emphasis. But also one of the things that I'm proud that we do is that we publish our DE&I stats as a company internally every quarter. And for us, it's not about writing a blog post that we publish out somewhere. It's really holding ourselves accountable to the team and saying, we're sharing this out to you. This is the progress that we've made in building a more diverse, equitable, and inclusive company. And I think that really comes to being open and transparent with that data, but also inviting conversation to say, it's like, what can we continue to do about this to make a more equitable environment?
Absolutely. It's about accountability. It's about transparency and continually measuring goals as well, because they are measurable. You can see the progress. And it really makes a difference too in terms of your team and employees. There's so many stats out there when people feel connected to their team, when they feel like they can trust the company, they do better work, they stay longer. And there are a lot of conversations right now around the great resignation, how to attract and retain top talent. What are kind of unique policies that you've either tested to increase retention across the company or really hold to be true around this conversation of, retaining talent?
And that's a great question. So when it comes to retaining talent, I don't think it's fair to boil anything down to secret formulas or that, but there are a couple of things that I feel that we've done as a company that have really worked well for us. But this is building on what we were talking about around equity. I think an important thing is just publishing and writing things down for it's like, this is where we stand on this. Here's how this policy works. Here's how this process works. So it's not something that's nebulous. And, if you want to create more of an equal playing field, you need to actually say, here are the way that things work and make sure that you're following that process. And some of these things, you may broadcast it to the company. It may just be something internal to the team, but it's making sure that you're operating based on norms, because you don't want to make a decision where it's like, well, I'm going to decide this way because of that person and that way because of another person. So some of the practices, I'm really, and this feeds into retention. But one of the practices that I'm really proud of us having implemented was to move away from negotiation as a part of the offer process. And at first, it may be a little bit, of a different experience for candidates, but we don't want somebody to feel that it's like, well, I didn't negotiate my offer, and then they feel like they left something on the table. We've come forward with the practice of saying we want to put our best foot forward with an offer. And it's not to say that we won't revise an offer if we get things wrong, or we looked at the leveling of a candidate and we should take a closer look, or our market data was out of date and we were referencing something incorrect. So we will revisit, but we need to have a good pragmatic grounding for it. And it's not something that's just because it's like, well, the candidate asked for more, so we're going to give them more. Because we recognize if you do that, it creates imbalances across the team. And so for us, it's important that we're maintaining equity across everyone. So, and I think that really does feed into retention, is making sure that everyone feels that they're, going to be treated equally across the team. But just as well, it's, we, especially as the market has picked up from over the last half a year or so, and especially growing as a distributed team, it's forced us to take a fresh look at our compensation practices. So right now we're in the middle of a massive project, which focuses around how are we going to look at compensation going forward in 2022 and beyond, especially as a distributed team, where we may be looking at compensation relative to market, whether somebody's in San Francisco or they're in Atlanta. It's how do you make sure that you're actually being equitable across all those different geographies. So, and I appreciate everyone from the CEO and throughout the people team. We're really focused on making sure that we get it right. But finally, on some of those retention policies, again, it goes back to other practices like proactively putting our employee voluntary relocation policy out there. So, and telling employees, hey, it's okay if you move. And I would say, at least by virtue of having that policy, about half a dozen employees have stayed with the company because they knew that they could move someplace new. But just as well, it's having not so much a policy focus, but a mental mindset shift around, you're not missing out if you're not in the office. So there was all this kind of fear, call it, in the summer of this year, where offices were starting to open back up. And it wasn't necessarily for us the question of, it's like, oh, do I have to come back to the office? But rather, am I going to be missing out because I'm not in the office? And for us, it was making sure that the script was, it's like the office is a place that you can go. The office isn't a place where decisions are made. So it was being really clear about that distinction was important for us in saying, we want to grow as a distributed team, and it's not about being, your career is going to continue to move forward regardless of what state or province that you're in. So.
Yeah, I think that sends a really good message too, in terms of reorienting your mindset around work and having the office be a tool, not the end all be all for where you need to go for career progression as well. I also appreciate the examples you gave too, because retention policies start day one of employee's journey. It starts during the offer letter stage, during the candidate experience as well, because it all really melds together there. In terms of employee experience, you could map it similar to a customer journey or similar to a product. Is there a touch point in the employee experience that is overlooked but you think is really important to retention, just based on your experience of growing teams and retaining folks?
Oh, goodness. I mean, I am really proud of the work that my colleagues on our workplace experience team do in making sure that we're having those unique touch points with employees. And so also one of the things that we have in our onboarding process is, like, we try and model the behaviors that we want to see across the company in our onboarding process. So we have 3 checkpoints with every new hire, where we're making sure that everything is well squared away with them, whether that's their first week check-in, their 30-day, their 60-day. And the focus is not just, okay, check the box and it's like, is everything squared away? But it's learning more about that employee and looking at ways for us to get them engaged in other parts of the company. So, and I love the fact that we have those sort of touch points. But just as well, when I think about employee experience, it's not something where it's like, here are the things that the company is doing for you as an employee, but rather, how can you bring employees into the fold of the work that you're doing? So whether it's planning a hackathon, we on the workplace or people teams may do a lot of the work that goes into it's like, let's make this possible. But it's giving employees the ability to, say, it's like, yes, we're behind you. We endorse you doing this sort of thing, and we want you to bring these sort of things up. So for us, when it comes to employee experience, it's driving a lot of participatory development of those things with employees. So it's not just always, okay, here's an event that we're putting on as a people or a workplace team, but rather, letting the teams come together and bring those ideas up too.
Participatory development, I think, is a key phrase there, because it's not just about creating these programs, creating these events, assuming what people want and need, you really have to kind of have that conversation, really keep a pulse on what's happening
Yeah.
with the team as well. And that's where you create those really progressive, impactful policies that people take advantage of, they use, and they stay at the company for, as you were talking about as well. I'm sure you've seen a lot of really great kind of case studies of how leaders have been innovative. Kind of you shared a couple personal ones as well, but even with the best intentions, people can make mistakes when you're changing things up, and that's okay. But what are some common mistakes you see leaders making when they are in like a hyper growth mode and they're expanding their team? Again, not necessarily at places you've worked at before.
Yeah. So I think especially when you're in hypergrowth, it's so easy for leaders to spend like 10 hours in a room talking about something. And they're like, it's so ingrained for them around what the plan is forward, or, just this knowledge that's second nature to them. But it's important for managers and leaders to keep in mind how that message gets filtered down throughout the rest of the organization. And it's being intentional about communications across the organization. And it can almost seem strange early on in saying, it's like you hear people talking about it, it's like, oh yeah, we need to focus on comms. And it's like, can I just tell the person? It's like, no, you need to have an intentional strategy for communicating change for employees. And things are changing so much, so fast. And again, at an executive level, you might be hearing about things and working through things so much, but it's making sure that you take a step back and saying, it's like, for an employee in the organization, are they actually getting that information? And it's not just about sharing it in one place, like an all hands meeting. It's having that intentional focus on communication strategy to say, if I'm busy, chances are everyone else is busy too. And it's easy for a message to fall through the cracks. So it's saying a communication strategy isn't just saying, great, I sent a message, but rather it's how am I going to make sure that this is internalized? So that would be my feedback to managers and leaders on hypergrowth.
Absolutely. Effective communication is so important, especially when things are constantly changing. And you're right, people are working on a bunch of different things. So it's not just about posting at one place or multiple places. Where you're hearing this information as well, the flow is important too. I'm sure you are continuously learning every day as well, and the multiple projects you're involved in and the great people that you're working with too. But what was one of your last learning moments, and what did you learn?
One of my last learning moments. So that's a really good question too. Well, I would, uh, uh, I'm gonna think on that one for a second. But actually, if you'll let me go back in time a little bit, I would say one of my biggest learning moments for myself was as an HR person, it's recognizing that not everyone is going to be comfortable coming to me and asking a question. So sometimes as that goes to, having a policy on something. So, so many years ago, I used to be of the mindset, it's like, well, if somebody has a question about this policy, they'll just come and ask me about it. But the truth is, for an employee, they may feel uncomfortable doing that, and while, I may do my best to try and create that open, welcoming environment, some employee may have had a bad experience at a past company that they carry forward with them. And while we want to encourage that open sort of dialogue, it's recognizing, I need to do my part, one, to make sure that, especially in a distributed context, that I'm accessible as a people leader, but just as well that, we're putting things down in writing. And like one of the things that was really important to me was doing things like writing out our parental leave policy in really significant detail. It's like, here's what happens, here's what to expect. And for some employees, that may not matter that much, but for others, where they're reticent to ask about that thing, we want to make that conversation easier for them. And even so, during the recruiting process, it's like making more of this information discoverable without having to ask. So that way, if it's on a candidate or an employee's mind, they're not, it's not about building up the courage to have that conversation, but it's rather, we've done our job to make sure that information is accessible, but also building a culture where they feel that an employee can come to us with whatever is on their mind.
Yeah, and I think that it's important kind of to remember too, to your point, that everybody is coming into this workplace with different experiences. So that doesn't mean that, that Dan is not approachable. It just means that somebody is just a little bit weary to kind of ask a question, and making things discoverable, easy to find, really clear. I think it's Brene Brown is like clear as kind in terms of communication and expectation. So I think that is really important to remember too, and a very good learning moment. Dan, is there anything that I didn't ask that you want to share, or one or two key insights that you hope people bring with them after listening to our conversation here today?
Yeah, well, one other thing that I'll add in is, especially as we're thinking about growth and growing in distributed contexts, it's recognizing that value of investing in a little bit of process around something earlier on, whether that's, having a framework or a structure for how you approach things, or having a data-driven view of things. All of those sort of mindsets pay such dividends as a company is growing. And as you have a little bit of a framework, you can build on it over time. But if you're trying to go from, you're already at 250 employees and now you're trying to do this sort of thing, whether that's implementing a career and leveling framework and compensation framework to match with it, it's so much easier to build from these things when you've even built out in a small scale early on versus trying to do it from scratch when you're a couple of hundred employees. So it's always taking a look, just as the rest of the organization does, on saying, how are we going to build for scale? So, and I think, it's really exciting to be able to sit down with other people and say, what do we need to do to make sure, these things are going to operate at 2, 3, 4, 5 times as many employees as we have today. So yeah.
Never too early to start the process.
Yeah, never too early.
And thank you so much for being on Reimagining Company Culture this afternoon. I enjoyed our conversation.
I enjoyed chatting with you as well. All right, till next time.
Until next time, and as a reminder for folks who are listening at AllVoices, we really believe in that employee feedback management as a requirement for the company to succeed as a whole. Have a good rest of your afternoon, everyone.